Good evening, friends. I had, of course, planned to say that I'm very glad to see all of you gathered here and to host such an eminent panel of speakers and to get today's conversation going. But in fact, as you all know, it's a trying and a somber moment for us to be talking about identity, origins, authenticity, native status, and related subjects. And I anticipate that we will be quite hard-pressed to focus on the early history and the prehistory of India when the present is bearing down on us with such crushing force against a backdrop that you're all well aware of. As you know, we are gathered to look at some new findings and to revisit very old debates, in fact, about our multiple identities as Indians, as South Asians, and indeed as human beings. In one of the books that we'll be drawing on for tonight's discussion, Which of Us Are Aryans, edited by Professor Thapar, the scientist Razib Khan uses the term mosaic to describe our genetic ancestry in South Asia. And when I was reading and preparing for this conversation, I kept remembering, of course, Walt Whitman's lines, I contain multitudes. Very well then, I contradict myself. I am large, I contain multitudes. At a time and in a context of ever-shrinking definitions of our selfhood, the ever-narrowing scope of our capacity to imagine the self and the other, the tightening pincer of political identities that are sharp, exclusive, and punishing, it feels almost like a luxury to retreat into the deep past when our unknown ancestors roamed the sparsely populated lands of Asia, swirling into the subcontinent like water, wave after incoming wave, in a series of intercontinental and transcontinental treks that lasted tens of thousands of years, where everyone was always already hybrid, mixed, and miscegenated. I was recently, just a couple of days ago, at a lecture by the great art historian B.N. Goswami, and some of the images that he was showing reminded me of the myth of the Samudra Manthan, the churning of the cosmic ocean, in which the gods and the demons, the Devatas and the Asuras, churn this gigantic primeval soup with this sort of churner, and all the identifiable entities, all creatures, all species, all identities indeed emerge one after the other from the deep. Some such continent-wide churn indeed yielded the peoples that we are now calling early Indians, and we are going to talk about them today. Just to set the stage a little bit in the context of conversations that we've been having here in the center for a very long time, many of us came to regard this question of prehistoric and early identities as crucial, stemming from our understanding of the history of the Sanskrit language. And this is certainly true for somebody like myself. Maybe 25 years ago, when I first started to learn Sanskrit, I discovered that the history of this ancient language has to do with some group of remote humans called the Indo-Europeans or the Indo-Aryans. And the existence of this group and of their language or languages was the basis for the creation and the perfection inscribed into the very name of this linguistic artifact that we call Sanskrita. Well-made, making perfect, a well-built entity from samskara and samskara and all these things. As Michael Witzel reminds us, the land in which the Aryas roamed, in which they lived and circulated, the idea of Vartana, in which this language self-described as perfectly made prevailed, that land, that zone, that space they called Aryavarta. We all know how this idea is currently being mobilized in our present day politics with some catastrophic effects. So who were these Aryans connected with the Sanskrit language and with the space whose extent is not clearly mapped in terms of modern nationalities that we call Aryavarta? Many of us are familiar with the writings of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar and his many engagements with the question of caste, against caste. But I'm not sure how many of us are familiar with his Indological oeuvre, his deep studies in Indology and Orientalist scholarship, in which he combs the ancient Sanskrit literature to try and understand the origins of the caste system and so many questions that he raises in the course of this kind of comprehensive engagement with the Brahminical literature. Who were the Aryans? Who were the Dravidians? Who were the Dasas? Who were the Shudras? Who were the Kshatriyas? Who were the Brahmins indeed? Who are the untouchables? Which is of course the central question for him. And later, who were the Buddhists? What are these identities sociologically, historically, linguistically, ethnically, racially, in terms of caste, in terms of religion, in terms of social status, in terms of political power? These are questions where do these groups come from? Where do these names come from? And what do they have to do with us, modern Indians? Even Ambedkar is asking this question perhaps half a century or 3/4 of a century ago or a century ago. What do we learn, what can we learn about them from Sanskrit texts? These and many related questions filled his books and preoccupied him from his earliest student days at Columbia University when he studied cultural anthropology to literally his deathbed where he completed his magnum opus, his last volume, The Buddha and his Dhamma. In the riddle of the Aryan, Ambedkar saw the earliest clue to millennia of social inequality and caste hierarchies on the Indian subcontinent. So in a sense, it's Ambedkar's disquiet that triggers for many of us modern scholars, modern historians, modern social scientists, that same disquiet about who were these Aryans, and it keeps us absorbed in trying to tease out the various aspects of the puzzle of the caste system, about which we will hear later today. I should say, just as an aside, that in the last 3 weeks or a month, some of our faculty here at the center have been engaged in very intensive readings with two very prominent scholars of Indology, Professor Patrick Olivelle, who is no longer here. He left us a few days ago, and Professor Johannes Bronkhorst, who is in our midst. We've been reading ancient texts, we've been reading the works and interpretations of these scholars, because we think it's our business as even as modernists, as social scientists, and as citizens, to inform ourselves about these questions as best we can by going to the sources, by going to the texts, and not plunging headlong into political debates without this kind of armature of scholarship and research. So today we have the great, the only Professor Romila Thapar, who needs no introduction, and so I will not give her any introduction. Because in a sense we are all her students, whether we acknowledge it or not, whether we know it or not, whether we realize it or not. We are all her students. No, Ashita, I'm not going to take half an hour. That is the convention, but I'm breaking the convention. Um, we also have Tony Joseph, who was formerly a business journalist, whose book Early Indians, published in December 2018, he told us is already in its 7th reprint and has traveled everywhere, been reviewed everywhere, been discussed everywhere, and has, of course, gotten into plenty of trouble, which we will try and make up for today through our civilized engagement and questions. And my old friend Friese, writer and editor, and currently one of the managing editors of India Today magazine, who has been writing for a wider audience in a journalistic vein about the politics of cultural nationalism around the new science of population genetics and population demographics that we are going to explore a little bit today. So no one actually is going to make a speech or a presentation today. We're just going to have a conversation. I will get the ball rolling with some questions. We might look at some maps because often we are talking about places whose modern names have nothing to do with their physical geographical names or their ancient names in languages which don't even exist anymore. And so please welcome our guests, Romila, Thapar, Tony Joseph, and Friese.
Speak. I've always been much more concerned with the historiographical aspect of what we popularly call the Aryan question. And one of the things that comes up repeatedly, particularly now that there is this, has been for some years, this huge controversy for over a century, the one thing that comes up is that people are really not familiar with the sources and the kinds of scholarship that has gone into the study of these sources. So what I'm trying to do today, very briefly, is simply talk about where we're at in these studies. It's a very complicated study, let me tell you that from the beginning. It involves a multiplicity of disciplines. It's not just knowing one language. It is a very complex study. That's true of a lot of interesting historical questions, but this in particular. So bear with me as I go along with it. The controversy in the study very often begins with trying to locate the Aryans in the context of the earlier civilization, as most of us believe, that is the Indus Civilization, or the Harappa culture as it is popularly called. That dates to 2700 to 1700 roughly, and the only evidence that we've been able to understand from this civilization is the archaeological evidence, because the pictograms have not been read so far. So it is the sole evidence of archaeology, as against the Rig Veda and the other Vedic texts that we use for the subsequent period, which is from about 1500 up to around 700 BC, where there is very little archaeological evidence in terms of the identification of archaeological sites with the texts, and the evidence is mainly textual. So one of the problems is, of course, that it is, if we're going strictly by the evidence, it is in a sense limited. But what I'm going to try and suggest is that depending on the way you look at this evidence, it needn't be as limited as it sounds. What is, first of all, the Aryans? This is a term that was invented by Max Muller in the 19th century. It doesn't occur anywhere before that. And it's based on two sources, the Rig Veda, which refers to the Arya and the Dasa, and the old Iranian texts that also refer to the Arya and the Daha, the H and the S being interchangeable in the two languages. The controversy, as it exists, centers on were the Aryans, indigenous, what was their origin? Secondly, what was their date? Were they pre-Harappan, Harappan or post-Harappan? And is there a continuity between the religion of the Aryans into Hinduism as it develops later on? If there is a continuity and there has to be a connection, then you have to argue that it is a pure race, a single religion, a single culture. They have to be indigenous. And the controversy then is, are they indigenous or are they groups that migrated in from elsewhere? Let me just turn to the map and tell you the areas that we're talking about. Can you all see this map? It's this kind of region. The Punjab and the northwest borderland, which is where the Rigved the region of the Punjab and the northwest borderland, which is where the Rigved was composed, or which the Rigved refers to, moving to different directions. Now, the first point I want to make is that the Indus Civilization is a very extensive civilization, going from the Pamirs, where the lapis lazuli was found, all the way down the Indus, across to the Gulf to Oman. There have been recent settlements of Harappans found in Oman near the copper ore areas because they were copper miners and they exported copper to Mesopotamia. And the Mesopotamian sources have a few seals that come from the Indus Civilization and refer to countries to the east of Mesopotamia as Makan, Dilmun and Meluha. We don't know the identity of these. We've all made guesses about them, but it's assumed generally that probably Meluha was somewhere in the Indus area. And then there is down the Indus River, and then south of the Sutlej, there's a little stream that goes off of Indus sites into the Doab. That's it. But it is, in fact, a very large area, as you can see. The Rigved is only a little portion of this large area. That's the geography that we know for sure. So please remember that when one is comparing the two, one is comparing a little fractional area with a huge bounding area. Secondly, very important, the Indus culture seems to be looking westwards. And its exports, imports and so on are of items that seem to relate to the cultures to the west. The Elamites, the Mesopotamians, the cultures of the Gulf. The Rigved and the Vedic sources, the later Vedic texts and the texts that were written as commentaries and exegesis on the Vedic sources, all move eastwards into the Ganga Valley. That is, they start with the Punjab and the Upper Doab, and then there is quite clear evidence of an eastward migration into the Ganga Valley. And please keep this in mind, because it's very difficult to say that the Harappans were Aryans, because what do you do with this geography then? It's not explained. The second thing where the map comes in is that the traditional scholarly idea is that you have Proto-European, Proto-Indo-European speakers in this area of Central Asia, and you had branches that moved off into different directions. One, it is thought, went into northeastern Iran, and that was the one that was juxtaposed to the Big Wave. And the two languages, Old Iranian and Old Indo-Aryan, which is the language of the Rigved, are what we call cognate languages. They are very closely related. The gods that they refer to are closely related. there are different social categories that are also closely related. So clearly, whether we like it or not, there was some kind of link between the northeastern Iranians and the Rigvedic Aryans. The other place where some evidence of Indo-Aryan has been found, very limited, is right across northern Syria, Anatolia, in the course of a treaty between the Hittites and the Mitannis. There are references to Mitra Varuna and Indra, Nasatyas and so on, and some terms that are used in horse trading. But the interesting thing about this evidence is that it's there in this treaty, it's there in one or two small sources, and then it disappears completely. There's no more trace of anything Indo-European or Indo-Aryan in that region. So fundamentally, the whole Indo-Aryan complex is something that concerns Iran and northern India. And this is a geography which please keep in mind. The other distinction that we make is between the cultures of the Indus Valley, which is essentially an urban culture of city dwellers with bricks, roads and drains, with trade. They're literate people and they have their own deities about which we don't know very much, as against the Vedic culture, which is agro-pastoral, shows no evidence of knowing about cities and towns and so on, is mainly herding and farming, is an oral tradition, not a literate tradition, and has specific deities which so far have been unconnected with the Harappan deities, so far. Of course, keep in mind, in the 19th century, the big obsession was race. There was something called race science, which was nicely invented, and the studies of Vedic societies were fitted into these racial categories that were worked out for the 19th century. Now, to talk about an Aryan race is, if I may say so, absolute baloney, to use a polite expression. It is a conflation of a linguistic category with a biological category. You do not refer to biological categories by languages, and you don't refer to languages by biological categories. Therefore, people have stopped using the term Aryan race. When I say people, I mean people who are in the lower things. Okay, so now I've talked about the geographical differences between the two, and these are the kinds of locations. The basic question, are they indigenous or are they migrants? And even if they are indigenous, is it a single culture, unadulterated by other cultures, which has been the foundation of a very single, pure religious culture that emerged out of it? Or is it a culture that has been brought together through the interface of a number of other cultures that might have existed? As I said, the geographical focus of the Aryas is the Rigveda in the northwest of India, Punjab and the upper Doab. Some clans may have migrated. Now we know that there were migrations from the borderlands into the Punjab. These are quite clear from the Rigveda. And migrations from the Punjab into the middle Ganga Valley, which is also very clear from the later Vedic texts like the Brahmana and so on, which actually describe these migrations and who carried them out. So that sense of movement is very strong in all these texts, however much people might like to deny it. People didn't come and just settle, or people didn't suddenly spring up in a place and stay put. They were constantly on the move. And if you read the Rigveda, which very, very few people do, alas, not even in translation, but they all quote from it. If you read the Rigveda, you get this tremendous sense of people on the move. And obviously they're on the move. They're herders with cattle and animals. They're looking for water. Water sources are absolutely crucial. And any pastoral society, anywhere in the world, is a society that has to move looking for water sources and pastures. This is absolutely essential. And then, as I said, there are these outside connections. All right, you may say that indigenous means, and the whole concept of indigenous is a bit strange, because it means people born in India. How do you define India? There were no cartographic boundaries in those days. There wasn't a lovely pillar at the Khyber Pass saying the limits of British India. These were open frontier regions with people passing through, coming across, mixing, and all the rest of it. So, in that kind of situation, how do you say this is indigenous and this is alien? On this side of the Khyber Pass, it's all indigenous. On the other side, they say it's all alien. This makes no sense for that time, where people wandered around quite happily because these boundaries did not exist. And it is very important to keep that in mind. Now, when we come to the relationship with northeastern Iran, which nobody speaks of except scholars, the public presentations never mention that there is this very close relationship. And what was that relationship? We should today be producing scholars of old Iranian, and we should be looking at the archaeology of northeastern Iran and doing comparative studies to see how far these two cultures were different and how far they were similar. This is absolutely crucial, but nobody is interested in that except scholars outside India. Similarly with the Mitanni Hittite material, how did it suddenly get there? I mean, those who talk about the indigenous Aryans going out say, oh yes, it was the Rigvedic Aryans who traveled west and went all the way to Syria and fought a battle there and had this treaty. And then you say, well, if they went this long distance from Punjab all the way across West Asia to northern Syria, there should be some trace of something that belongs to the Punjab in northern Syria at that point. There isn't. Especially surprising because earlier on there had been during the period of the Harappa culture. And then, of course, there is what originally started this whole ball rolling, the fact that you have language similarities between Sanskrit and Old Iranian and Greek and Celtic. Then many of the names of the gods are similar. Mitra, Varuna, the Greek Uranus is Varuna, the Roman Mitra is the Mitra of these earlier times. So you have these similarities which are very puzzling. And the question is, how did these similarities come about? Okay, the archaeology, unfortunately so far, is not of too much help. Because what one is really looking for, if this is an indigenous culture, and a single culture, and a well-defined culture, and at one point it's all over the northern part of the subcontinent, there should be archaeologically a counterpart of a single culture which is spread all over the northern part of the subcontinent. But unfortunately there isn't that. The archaeological evidence suggests localized cultures, some concentrated in the southern part of Punjab, in the watershed, and in the Doha, some scattered in different places. But there's no striking, recognizable culture which in fact follows the line of the migration that is described in the texts, as you would expect if in fact the archaeology is reflecting what the texts say. Can we therefore argue, and this is a question that many of us are asking, that there were a few diverse populations scattered across this area of North India? Leave aside migration and invasion for the moment. There were these diverse populations scattered across. Some perhaps surviving as the leftovers, the remains of the Harappa culture. That is perfectly possible because there's one of the 3 or 4 sites where you've got a mix of late Harappan and another culture. So it's possible there was some survival. And there are sites in the watershed where this mixture is more frequent. And others are very sites with overlapping layers, which would indicate that one is not looking for a single culture, but one is looking for a multiplicity of cultures that happen to be there and happen to get related. And then, of course, the question is, if there were a multiplicity of cultures, how did they get related? How did they relate to each other? If these people are migrants from outside, coming into the Punjab and finally landing up in the Lower, and then from Lower migrating eastwards, there should be many similar cultures scattered all over this region, which so far there are not. And I deliberately say so far because with archaeology you never know what may be found 10 years down the line. It's always a question. The attempt that is being made at the moment, for example, to change the name of the Indus Civilization to the Saraswati Civilization is another major problem because it involves hydrology. It's not just the Sanskrit language and it's not just the geography of the Ringway. It does involve hydrology, and very few good Sanskritists are also good hydrologists. The combination of these sciences is often rather difficult. Alright, so the argument is that there's this river called the Ghaggar, which those of you that travel to Chandigarh will know. It runs in this kind of area. It is thought to have been connected. It is thought to have been connected with an ancient river called the Hakra, which went underground suddenly into the desert around 1900 BC. It disappeared. But the claim is that the Ghaggar is in fact the old Saraswati of the Ringway. Alright, there's a debate on this. And what is the debate? That we have no really serious evidence so far to equate the Ghaggar, sorry, did I say Ghaggar? No, Ghaggar. The Ghaggar with the Saraswati. But there's this curious bit of information that comes from the Iranian sources, from the Avesta, which refers to a river called the Harapswati, the Helmand of today, which runs in the Afghanistan region. And given the interchange of H and S, the Harapswati could be the Saraswati. So is the Ringved referring to that river on the other side of the Indus, that side, or is it referring to this river about which we really don't have any absolute evidence? Now this is an open question. My fear is that the reason why there is a desperate attempt to find the Saraswati. The Haryana government is sinking bore wells all the way down the Ghaggar in order to locate this underground river. Simply because if you can call it the Saraswati civilization, you link it up with the Vedic sources. So that is the kind of problem at one level that we historians are facing. Sorry, we went on too long. Should I cut it short? One thing that I do want to talk about a little bit is migration and invasion. Now, over 50, 60 years ago, the question of the Aryan invasion of India was questioned, was challenged. 50 years ago, it was challenged fully, and many of us were involved in making that challenge and denying that there was an invasion. And we said there was no invasion, there were groups of Aryans that came from Central Asia in little snippets and came and settled down. But to this day, people go on saying, oh, these people who talk about the invasion stroke migration. Now, this is absolute ignorance of the worst kind, because the nature of invasion is totally different from the nature of migration. Invasion is when hordes of people come in, suddenly overtake a place, loot the place, destroy it, etc., and go away, or scatter. Migration is a very systematic movement of people coming in and settling down. And then maybe settling down, and after a while from that settlement, another little group will get up and move further and settle again. The notion of settling down is terribly important. And I want you to keep this in mind because it has to do very strongly with the next point that I want to make, which is who were these people with whom the Aryan speakers were in contact and with whom they had relations both friendly and hostile. Among them, the most important, of course, are the dasas. And the Rig Veda is full of business of Arya Varna and the Dasa Varna. And the dasas are completely different from the Aryas. They have different deities, they have different rituals, etc., etc. They speak another language, they have strange practices. They worship the phallus, which horrifies some of the Aryan authors. But interestingly, they're very wealthy, they have a lot of cattle, so there's a lot of hustling going on. They're constantly going for these dasa cattle hordes in the stockades where the cattle is kept and so on. The Aryas keep on saying these dasas cannot speak the language, therefore they're called Ridravacha, people of incorrect speech or hostile speech. And Lech. Lech is very interesting, or I have not time to explain it if it comes up. Get it coming up. Lech again, they're all, Lech is a term which is used repeatedly for people who cannot speak our language. This is a very, very strong distinction, apart from other distinctions of people that are low caste and all the rest of it. So you've got the presence of these dasas, which is screaming at you from the big name. But everybody goes on saying that there was only one culture, there was only one people, there was one culture, Aryan culture. So what do we do with the dasas? Anyway, then there's a very interesting category that nobody ever talks about. That is the Dasi Putra Brahmins. It's not so wrong. How can you have a Dasi Putra Brahman? They're contradictory, yet they're referred to. And some of the greatest sages that are writing hymns in the Rig Veda, people, like Kavish Aylusha and others of that kind, they're described as having their mothers were dasis. The Upanishads, to the famous story of Satyakama Jabala, who was asked, "Are you a Brahmin?" And he says, "I don't know. My mother said she was working as a dasi in a household, a maid in a household. And there were many men that came and went, and she doesn't know who your father is," she said to me. So the sage Gautama turns around and says, "Only a Brahmin will tell this truth and accepts him as a Brahmin." Now, what I'm trying to suggest is that you have a very human kind of situation where you have people coming into areas that they're unfamiliar with. They're meeting other people that they're unfamiliar with and so on. And therefore, what is the reaction that you expect? It's a reaction that is the kind of reaction that various historians have been writing about and suggesting. They're the Ashuras. Again, they're strange people. If they're not demons, they're strange human beings. So they bury their dead. And then, of course, one immediately says, burying the dead hasn't got anything to do with the megalithic culture. The megalithic culture is the archeology of the peninsula. And so that raises another set of questions. Or you have the Vratyas, who describe this as, they know the language, they don't speak it, but they have very strange customs. They're not Aryas. Now, who are all these people? Why don't we do a list of all the people who are strange and odd and who are Lech and Ridravat and so on, and try and find out who they are and what their relationship was. Okay.
Just one.
Yeah.
Okay, I think you've set the stage as you have done in the book, and as you've done in multiple books that you've actually written on this question, bringing up a lot of what has accumulated by way of knowledge incrementally through the history, through the archaeology, and through a close reading of the Rig Veda, as the oldest text that is available to us, to set up a map as well as a sort of set of themes about the populations that we are or we are not describing through a category like the Vedic Aryans, the Vedic people, the Indo-Aryans and so on. I want to return to some of these questions, and I know Professor Thapar has something to say on issues of language and linguistics, which are actually key to our thematization of this problem. But one of the things we hope to do this evening is look at new research that has been becoming public in the last few years, some of which is actually not even completely out yet, which is based on the study of genetic data, both of contemporary populations all over India and other parts of the world, other parts of Asia, but also ancient DNA obtained from skeletal remains and other kinds of human remains from archaeological sites, not only to do with Aryans, but also really importantly to do with the Indus Valley civilization, with the Harappan people, and some of these sites have yielded very, very, very rich scientific material. And of course, as with all the other material that we have so far, the archaeological, the historical, the linguistic and so on, there is a very intense set of debates about how to interpret this data, what to put out in the public, how to share it, because it has such strong political implications. So just to introduce perhaps the main findings in the simplest possible terms, I'm going to ask Tony Joseph, who has written this best-selling award-winning book, taking numerous scientific papers and studies into consideration, meeting with scientists, traveling all over the world, going to genetic population labs, and distilling this data into a form that you and I can understand. I'm just going to ask Tony Joseph to introduce some of the main findings, and we hope that we can actually appreciate how potentially game-changing these are likely to be in terms of our understanding of the prehistory of modern India. So Tony, please, and I think you might be using maybe, possibly, yeah.
Thank you, Ananya. It's terrifying to be speaking after Professor Romila Thapar, the head of depth of knowledge and understanding the inside. And I believe that what I'm going to say will not be conflict with the exposition that she has made. And also Dr. Thapar was one of the first academics that I met when I started on this journey 6 years ago. The way that you're going to look at the question that I'm going to look at is different from who the Aryans are, and we would be looking at who are the Indians, and in that context we will hopefully arrive at some clues to who the Aryans are, to Aryan are to. I started on this project 6 years ago to answer the question who were the Harappans, then slowly realized that you can't answer who the Harappans are unless you know who were the first farmers in India, because the Harappan civilization grew naturally out of the agricultural revolution that happened in the northwestern part of India. And you can't really answer who the first farmers are unless you know who were the first Indians. So stage by stage you realize that you can't really answer the questions unless you can grapple with the fundamental question of who are we basically. And it just happened so that in the last 5 years, these questions, which could not have been answered as clearly as they could not have been answered clearly, do now have fairly convincing answers thanks to a new discipline called population genetics. Population genetics has been tackling the issue of, have been using the genomes of current living populations to understand how different population groups are related to each other, how closely or how distantly. This was useful. For example, a study that was done in 2009 by the CCMB, Center for Cellular and Molecular Biology of Hyderabad, and Harvard University came up with the result that North Indian populations were more closely related to West Eurasians, that is, West Asians, Central Asians, Europeans, than South Indian populations. This was based on genomes of currently living populations. But this study could not explain how did this relationship come about. Did Indians or North Indians move to West Asia and Central Asia and Europe, or did they come in North India? Now this is what has changed in the last 5-6 years and dramatically. What has changed is the fact that geneticists have now acquired the ability to extract ancient DNA, that is DNA from people who lived thousands or tens of thousands of years ago, and this has changed our understanding of prehistory, not just in South Asia but across the world. How does this do so? Because if you have to imagine that there's an ancient archaeological site in New Delhi from where you have collected DNA from 4,000 years ago, and that shows no sign of, let's say, West Asian ancestry, and that you have also collected DNA from 3,000 years ago, and that shows clearly that there is a West Asian ancestry. Now you can say that between 4,000 years ago and 3,000 years ago, there is a new ancestry that arrived in India, into New Delhi. Now, this has answered the question of direction of movement and how those relationships that we talked about, that geneticists, population genetics earlier decipher, how did that come about? And this has completely changed our understanding of previously around the world. Just to give an example, we now know that European population was changed twice over, just in the last 10,000 years. The first one happened when new farmers from what was known as Anatolia and Friese Turkey moved into Europe. This replacing to a large extent and mixing to a smaller extent with the existing hunter-gatherers of Europe. That's about 9,000 years ago. Then about 5,000 years ago, another group from Central Asia, from Central Asian steppe, a group that's called Ananya, moved into Europe, again displaced substantially or mixed to some extent with the then existing farmers and the remaining hunter-gatherers. So if you want to know European population formation, this is what briefly explains how the European population was formed. So this is the kind of knowledge that we today have about almost all regions, all major regions of the world. We know that at least 3 migrations from Asia through the Bering Straits from Siberia into America populated the Americas after 16,000 years ago. Obviously, we are talking thousands and thousands of years before the first European set foot in the Americas. We also know that in Southeast Asia has been, in the last 4,000 years, the population has turned over twice over, both times from migration starting from the agricultural heartland of China. The first migration through the land route and the second migration through the island hopping route. It changed the demography of the entire East Asia and Southeast Asia, and to some extent India too, it reached India too. So this may all look like arbitrary movements of people that happen in your places and all times and that shape populations. But today, with the knowledge that we have, we can, to some extent, classify and understand that there are about 4 classes of migrations, global migrations, that have shaped global demography as it is. And these stand out from every other migration that may happen at different places and different times through all of time. these four migrations stand out for their global impact and also for the fact that they are driven by global forces, by which I mean that when we look back, we can understand why those migrations happened when they did. The first one most of you would already know, is the out of Africa migrations that happened around 70,000 years ago, when the first modern humans, or Homo sapiens, moved out of Africa into the Arabian Peninsula, and then over the next tens of thousands of years went on to populate all of the rest of the world. All the non-African population in the world comes from a single population that moved out of Africa, a small subset of the African population that moved out into the Arabian Peninsula roughly 70,000 years ago. How do we know this? Modern day genomes of all non-African peoples around the world will show that they all owe their ancestry to this small group of Africans. The last major continent that they occupied and settled in was the Americas, and that I said happened around 16,000 years ago. So between 75,000 years ago and 16,000 years ago, they spread throughout the world, occupying different parts and regions. A critical thing to remember is that while this was happening, a crucial period intervened, which is a glacial period, a very large, long-lasting glacial period intervened between 29,000 years ago and 14,000 years ago. When glacial periods happen, water gets locked up in ice. There's little evaporation, which means there's great aridity, which means lush green areas turn into deserts, and the habitable areas around the world become far less. In short, the Homo sapien populations that have been expanding around the world got separated from each other for a long period of time, and they developed along slightly different evolutionary paths, accumulating very minor genetic differences. Please remember that 99.9% of all modern human genomes are similar. The differences that we are talking about are 0.1%. So that's what intervened. So the next major class of migrations happens after this glacial period is over. The world starts warming up around 7 degrees Celsius on average. And when we can see human populations, or modern human populations on many different parts of the world, experimenting with agriculture. Not all of those experiments were successful. Not all those that were successful were sustainable. Not all those that were sustainable were very advantageous. We know, for example, that by and large, those who were in geographic locations where they had the possibility of domesticating cereals, were in a far better position than those who were in Southeast Asia or in the Pacific Islands, who could domesticate only tubers and yams and bananas, which need much lower productivity. So people who were, took to cereal cultivation like the wheat, barley, rice, which means the Indians, the Chinese, the Egyptians, Mesopotamians, all. So what was their agriculture expanded, they settled down, and what you could see was what you can expect, a huge population explosion, which is nothing comparable to the way that hunter-gatherer populations grow. This is a huge, tremendous growth in population. This depends on when areas move into agricultural transformation. The earliest cereal cultivation that we have evidence for is in Mesopotamia, that we could say somewhere around 10,000 years ago, 11,000 years ago. So this population movement, and when population explodes like that, what can you expect? You can expect major migrations. So this is the second major class of migrations that happened as a result of modern humans taking to agriculture and the resulting population expansion. Wherever this happened out of Mesopotamia, this happened out of China, it's happened wherever major agriculture. So this is the second major class of migrations. The third major class of migrations happened when some modern human population groups gained mastery over the horse and therefore mobility and to some extent greater mastery over the metallurgy, which again allowed far greater mobility compared to existing other population groups. And that changed demography over a wide part of Eurasia, from Iceland at one end, West Asia, South Asia, Central Asia, all up to Xinjiang in China. We could roughly call it the Bronze Age migrations. And this would be the third class of migrations which changed demography across a large part of the world. The fourth class of migrations, these three that we talked about, belong to prehistory, as in history before, by and large, before people started writing. 5,000 years ago, to 5,000 years ago, roughly. These three migrations happened when in prehistory, by and large, before people had. But the fourth class of migrations I am talking about happened. We are all very familiar with it. We have. This would be the colonial migrations, because after some modern human population groups gained mastery over the seas, they invented steamships to travel large distances, conquer new territories. We could call them the colonial migrations, and this changed the shape of demography across large parts of the world, in the Americas, in Australia, in many parts of the world. Now we come to the question of India and our part. We know that out of these four migrations, the last one did not cause a very major impact on our demography, because the Europeans who came to India as part of colonial migrations were too few in number relative to the existing population. So they left virtually no mark on our demography, so we can completely ignore them. But we have to grapple with the other three classes of migrations if we need to understand Indian demography. And the first class of migrations that we know is the out of Africa migrations. We know that they reached in India around 65,000 years ago, because the people who reached in the Indian subcontinent, we know that they moved on to Southeast Asia and Australia, and from fossil evidence from Southeast Asia and Australia, we know they were in Australia by 59,000 years ago, in Southeast Asia by 63,000 years ago. So therefore it's a safe assumption to make that they were in India at least by 65,000 years ago. To cut short, we know that when they arrived in India, they were not coming by empty and inviting land like the first modern humans who reached the Americas or the Australia, where even they had animals and birds, but never seen a Homo species before, and therefore were easy prey to the expanding modern humans. In India, they came to a land that we know for sure was already populated robustly by other Homo lineages, who are also called humans, by the way, which is why we call ourselves modern humans. It has been, we have often thought that modern humans were significantly superior to other earlier humans or Homo lineages, and that we were born with much greater understanding, brains, etc. All this is bunkum. We know that this is not true. For most of the period that the modern humans shared with other Homo lineages, it's difficult for us to distinguish the kind of tools that they made. Some of the Homo lineages had larger brains than us, and we know from the stone tools left behind that especially central India and southern India, the peninsular India was populated very heavily by other Homo lineages. We do not know what they were. Could be Homo erectus, could be Homo heidelbergensis, could be lineages that have not been identified yet. We do not know what they belong to, but we do know that they were present here in large numbers. The earliest stone tool that they have left behind is 1.5 million years ago. It was recovered from Athirampakam near Chennai. 1.5 million years ago, mind you, modern human, the first fossil of the modern human is only 300,000 years ago. So you're saying other Homo lineages have been in India for 5 times as long as modern humans after they came into existence. So archaeologists believe that they did not immediately occupy, they stayed out of the way of the robust population of Homo sapiens, and that they took a sub-Himalayan route. When you say sub-Himalayan route, please remember we are not talking about one generation, we are talking about multiple generations or long periods of time who moved on to Southeast Asia. It is also possible that another branch took a western coastal route down and then went up the eastern coastal route and then went across to Southeast Asia and other regions. We have evidence to think that by around 35,000 years ago, that's about 30,000 years after we arrived, that they may have become, for want of a better word, the masters aboard that the sea in the subcontinent, in the sense that we all know that all other Homo lineages went extinct, not just in India, across the world. Neanderthals went extinct in Europe around 40,000 years ago. Homo erectus also went extinct much before that everywhere. So it's possible that around 35,000 years ago or so, that modern humans were the only human species that were left behind in the Indian subcontinent, so that after that we don't need to call them modern humans, we can just call them humans. The reason is too complicated to explain why 35,000, so I move on to the next one. So this is the first migration that shaped the Indian demography. And there is an important point. Where are they today? Where can we find them today? We often used to ask, where can we find the first Indians? Do we have to go to the Andaman Islands? Where do we have to go? We now have the answer. Mostly you have to look in the mirror. Or look around. And because this is a finding we did not know earlier. Most population groups in India, 50 to 65% of their ancestry comes from the first Indians. That's people who got here 65,000 years ago. All the other migrations make up only for the rest of it. So this applies to most Indian population groups. So if you want to know who were the first Indians, we don't have to go far, we only have to look in the mirror. Now the second migration is second migration belongs to the second class of migrations, which is the agriculture-related Neolithic expansions, and we had two of them. One from West Asia that happened around 9,000 years ago. We know that from genetic evidence. If there are question and answer, we will answer what is the genetic evidence and how do you know? This is ancient DNA evidence. And this West Asian population from broadly the Zagros region of Iran mixed with the first Indians, that is descendants, my book calls them first Indians, the descendants of the out of African migrants who reached India. And it is this combined population, now we know, that created the agricultural revolution, that spread the agricultural revolution in northwestern India, that gradually grew into the Harappan civilization. So now we have the answer to the question, who were the Harappans? Harappans were a mixture of first Indians and West Asians. There is also another third migration that happened from East Asia, that happened around 4,000 years ago, when, as I said, there were two agricultural migrations that happened out of the agricultural heartland of China, after China took to agriculture. And one of them took the land route, and it came through Southeast Asia, and the spread was called Austro-Asiatic languages. And the last leg of it reached India after 2,000 years ago. We have our Austro-Asiatic languages are Khasi, Mundai. These are spoken by tribals in central and eastern India, and they belong to the same family of languages called Mon-Khmer, which are spoken in Laos, Vietnam, many of the Southeast Asian countries. So this is the third migration that formed Indian population. That takes us to the last migration, which is the Bronze Age migration from the steppe, which according to again ancient DNA evidence, we can discuss it later if there is time, which reached India from regions today known as Kazakhstan in Central Asia, between 4000 BCE and between 2000 BCE and 1000 BCE. That's between 4000 to 3000 years ago. And they brought, there is strong reason to believe that they brought Indo-European languages, and that these are the people who call themselves Aryan. Arya, as was explained earlier, is not a racial term. It's a term. It's a term that signifies Indo-European, Indo-Aryan language-speaking people who call themselves Aryan. So this is the period of the last migration, and the thing to remember is that the Central Asian groups also moved into Europe 1,000 years earlier, before they moved into India. Central Asian step pastoralists moved into Europe. So this migrations both from Central Asia into Europe and into South Asia in many ways solves an old problem of how did Indo-European languages get spread the way that they are. About 40% of the world today speaks an Indo-European language, from Hindi to Persian to Russian to English to all of that, Greek, Latin, almost all of Western European languages except Basque. So Indo-European languages are spread from Iceland in the west to India in the east, and there is no community out to the east of India that speaks an Indo-European language. So you need to answer the question, how did this language family get spread in this way? 75% of Indians speak an Indo-Aryan language, which is a subset of the Indo-European language. So how did it get spread in this way? The answer is, whichever region in this language spread that you take, either the language had to have started there and spread elsewhere, or it had to have come into that region from elsewhere. This applies to India. Now, if you assume that the language spread from India to the west or to the rest of the world, you would expect to see at least some genetic trade of the first Indians going across West Asia, Central Asia, East Asia, West Asia, Eastern Europe, Western Europe, all the way to Iceland perhaps. At least some minor trade at least of the First Asian ancestry. But the interesting thing is that the First Asian ancestry is limited to South Asia. It has no close relatives outside of India. You might ask, what about those East Asians and Australians? Yes, they're relatives, but they're split from us 50,000 years ago. You can no longer call them close relatives. The First Asian ancestry, which is spread all across the Indian subcontinent and South Asia in general, which was a major part and a component of the Indus, of the Harappan civilization. And no population group escapes the first Indian ancestry, or everybody has first Indian ancestry. That has led no trade outside of South Asia, with one exception, and that exception proves the point. What is the exception? The exception are the Roma, earlier called the Gypsies, who we know that left India, the northwestern part of India, Rajasthan, Gujarat, that region, around 1,500 years ago. So that is long after the Indo-European languages came to be spread across around this region. So they could not have spread the Indo-European languages. And recent genetic studies have shown that the Roma do carry the haplogroups or the distinctive genetic lineage, the mitochondrial or the maternal lineage of the first Indians of South Asia. So when there is actually a migration of people who went from India, it does carry the first Indian ancestry. So when you look at multiple ways, there is the only migratory evidence that supports or that explains the spread of Indo-European languages the way that they are spread in the world today is that then there are a whole lot of other evidences and arguments too, but we'll stop here.
No, well, that too. But the timing of the arrival of what became the Harappans in the West Asian migration, and those who became the Aryans in the third stage from the steppes and Kazakhstan. And we'll talk a little bit about the relationship there. I'll also ask you to talk about ancestral North Indians and ancestral South Indians, and how we arrive at what we call Dravidian populations. But Kai, just to sort of bring you in this discussion, you have written about the Rakhigari findings. And you say very interestingly in this book that recent years have been a very busy time in ancient Indian history and modern Indian politics. And this is where the tinderbox kind of explodes. Professor Thapar has also pointed out that questions about our origins are enmeshed in cultural politics from the very beginning, from the 19th century. And I think all the authors confront problems from really a single source, which is a Hindu nationalist version of who we are, where we came from, who belongs and who doesn't. So I'll just ask Kai to perhaps table some of the findings that are available, some of which are not available quite yet, or are only very hesitantly being shared by scientists, given that they have to continue their research within a political environment that is largely not receptive to the kinds of findings that they might actually have based on the data that they're able to gather. So, Kai, please.
Right, well I should say that because of this article I wrote pretty much a year ago.
Can't hear you.
Is this not on? Can you hear me? Yeah. Yeah, I was saying I'm here because of the article I wrote about a year ago. It was actually originally published in its original form in India Today in August, I think, and at that stage I was already very angry because I'd written it a month earlier and the magazine had sat on it. And I thought it was a scoop because essentially I had been, for more than a year, been chasing archaeologists and geneticists who had been working on providing what was supposed to be the first DNA sample of a Harappan individual from a Harappan site. The distinction is important because a little earlier there has been a paper published which purported to, quite convincingly, to offer DNA analysis of Harappan individuals, but from sites that Harappans were in trading contact with. So this would be but a sample from the site of Rakhigari, a site that was discovered first in 1963, and a 4,500-year-old skeleton. It's in Neargene. Yeah, it's a famous and very large site. Sometimes I think erroneously called the largest or bigger than Harappa. But its full extent is large, but it consists of settlements of various phases of Harappan civilization. Not all of which cover the same area. At any rate, after some earlier attempts, there was apparently going to be a successful attempt at retrieving DNA material from an individual, and much of the speculation in the build-up was around whether or not the individual would have steppe ancestry or chromosomes and genes which have been associated with steppe population, which of course many people who from the Hindu society who object to this whole notion of migration from the steppe into see as indigenous ancestry, but its absence at this time could be seen as establishing that these people had not arrived and therefore this is not indigenous. Now what happened was, okay, I originally started speaking to people who were closely involved in this a year earlier. at that stage already they were saying, in a month. Tony knows this also. We were talking on the way over about the fact that he didn't talk about graphic area at all, and for a good reason. And he says he's given up on it. A year after this process began, I had been cultivating many geneticists, and I have to say more than one, both in India and outside, linked to me. What they said was a near final draft of the findings. And I wrote a story based on that, saying also that this was likely to be released in a month or so, which is generally what was being said. It is still what is being said. The paper was never published at that stage, and
I was told the same thing. I did come to publish in 2 months.
Right.
2 months. 4 years. 4 years.
So this has been going on. But what had also happened was that people associated with this research had begun speaking to journalists, myself and others, and hinting very broadly about the results. Now, this was already very political because one significant individual who was an archaeologist, and crucial to the whole thing because he was responsible for the dig from which the DNA and the skeletons were obtained, repeatedly seemed to be telling journalists that what will emerge will bolster the out of India theory, if you like, that languages and people, the Indo-European languages, exist in this way because of a migration of people out of India, which would essentially mean that your Vedic civilization also comes from people who are indigenous, anciently indigenous, which has obvious political connotations for the people who believe this. Now, other people, notably geneticists, this person was an archaeologist, who I spoke to, and others also spoke to, was saying quite the opposite, which was a little puzzling, except for the politics of it. And the draft of the paper that was leaked to me also said the opposite. The paper was pretty much in concordance with the narrative Tony has told us, and with this earlier paper I mentioned, which identified or modeled Harappan DNA from bodies that had been found in sites that were in trading contact with the Harappans. So I mean, the conclusion was, and my original title for the article was An Inconvenient Truth. That this was not a result that would go down well with the Indian government at the time, and would be difficult for some of the scholars to be associated. And I have to say, from the beginning, even as archaeologists I mentioned, told me this is a very politically sensitive issue, so we have to be careful. Geneticists told me that we face a lot of pressure. We are under great pressure. It is difficult for us to talk about these things. So, yeah, as I said, at the end of the day, the paper did not appear a month later, or several months later. We subsequently met David Reich at Professor Thapar's house, who is the lead American geneticist. This was also a bit of a transition. When this whole project started, it was between a team of archaeologists from Deccan College and Korean researchers from the National University of Korea in Seoul, I think. But the story, I heard from several people, was that the Koreans had not done a great job and possibly contaminated one sample. And then this David Reich's lab from Harvard was involved, along with a lab in India. current status is, again, I recently went to a public event where Gautam Shinde, who's an archaeologist deeply involved in this project, attended, and he said the paper would be published in about a month, but he also said it would be published in either Nature or Science, two very prestigious scientific journals. But it seems odd to me that it is still up for grabs between two of them with only a month to go. But yeah, other geneticists also in India and America who are in touch with both teams have said that it is imminent. The word is that the American team has acquired somehow many more samples than were talked about in the version of the paper I saw, when it was based on one male individual, and unofficially I was also told that some samples had been attempted from another female individual, but they had not a great deal from it, so they were leaving it out of the paper. I can't confirm is that they may have been able to sequence that individual better. Yeah, the other thing I would like to talk about, just briefly, is to go back to the politics and the discomfort of scientists, of geneticists, and perhaps even historians working on this issue. As I said, I was pursuing this specific story for well over a year now, over 2 years, and I was often puzzled by the fact that Indian specialists particularly would, or some of them would on the one hand maintain, stick to this out of India theory, which it's very hard to find adherents of anywhere else in the world. And yet they would put their name to papers, particularly which were up for international publication in prestigious venues, which were saying entirely the opposite. Yeah, so this was certainly true of, it seemed to me of Dr. Shinde, the archaeologist, whose name was on this earlier, where this map also appears, the Harappan and Elamite paper, which also primarily produced from David Wright's lab, which essentially talks about significant migration from the steppe into India, contributing a lot of genetic material, and male-mediated, sex-skewed migration. Shinde's there as a co-author. He did tell me that he asked them to remove, not to remove the word migration, but the concept, the effect of the paper is entirely obvious. Similarly, another Indian geneticist, one of the few, I have to say, who again has stuck to this OIT theory, Yaneshwar Chaubey, who used to be in Estonia, but is now at BHU, I think. But who is an accredited and acknowledged genetic scientist. So I saw him at a talk also recently, where again he gave a ringing defense of out of India, with reference to some papers that we can also talk about if you want to get to that. But he again was recently a co-author on a piece looking at basically the genome of the current inhabitants of roughly the Indus Valley area, which again is, acknowledged steppe migration into India as obvious. And I asked another geneticist colleague of this fellow, since they know each other and work together, how does this happen? You talk about such things, and he said, no, we avoid talking about such things because we're under a lot of pressure. Yeah, I'll leave it there for the moment. There's various things we can go into.
So, I think there's a set of questions that causing these mixed signals to be put out there, right? One is the relative age and ancient pedigree of different groups, whether it's Aryan or Dravidian or Harappan, right? Essentially these three groups. Who's more ancient? Who was here first? Who came from outside in? Who was here already and probably went out or maybe didn't go out or whatever it is? What is the relationship between these three groups? Chronologically, in terms of depth of historical record, but then further down the line, how do we relate to them differentially in South India and North India, and in what is today Pakistan? I mean, a lot of these sites are also shared across the border. So we haven't even touched on what forms these questions take there. But I think what's so interesting about what you said, Kai, is that the science in a sense speaks for itself. The scientists are not willing to spell out what their own findings are telling us. And this is accounted for by political conditions that make it difficult for them. So they can publish in scientific journals, but they can't publish in popular magazines in India. They can't be part of the public debate unless they're off the record or they're operating through this system of leaks and papers that are coming but haven't yet come, etc. Those kind of things.
I mean, I do think it's complicated. I don't think Ganesh Rachove is lying that he believes there is good evidence for out of India.
Right.
I think he also, but he's in a situation where the bind is that he wants to get along in his professional work as well, where he will be willing to go with pieces that may be saying something else, but he's more comfortable with this.
So Tony, maybe you can just spell out for us a little bit exactly what the difficulties are in reconciling desired political claims and actual evidence.
One of the geneticists did say that when he does population genetic studies in other countries, people don't really care. They don't really care which way the results come. I mean, it might amuse them a bit, but it's not something on which the identity revolves around. But that when he worked with Indians in Indian labs, that was not the case. There is obvious jubilation when the results are one way, and the response is much more disheartening when the results are other. People identify with certain identities or don't identify with certain identities. That's the only reason I can think for such a response. Could also suggest that our national identity is not settled as in other countries which are much more relaxed about what ancient history says about where we come from. And I think which is one of the reasons why I wrote in my book, use the metaphor of the pizza, because we don't often, to understand it, it also answers one of the earlier questions. Who are we? The answer is that we all carry the bit in different proportions of those four major migrations that make it. So I use the metaphor of the pizza. A lot of people who don't like that, they would like me to use masala dosa or something else, but I can't find a better metaphor than pizza. If anybody has a better suggestion, I will go. Why the pizza? Because the basic the base of the Indian population in demography, this is something we did not know earlier, is the first Indian ancestry. 60 to 65% most Indian population groups carry the ancestry of the first Indian. When you say first Indian, again, India is used in my book for standing for all of South Asia, not just India, not India in the sense of Republic of India, but India in the old sense. So this applies to all of South Asia. And this 65% ancestry, please remember that this is unique. You will not find this ancestry anywhere else in the world. Right? So our demographic pizza is unique because its base is unique. You will not find anything else. That's what makes someone else say, you perhaps, I don't know, this I don't know, but perhaps someone say that you look South Asian. Why is that? Because the base of the pizza is unique. On top of that comes the sauce. The sauce are the Harappans, which is a mixed population of First Indians and West Asians. Why is that? Because when their civilization declined after 1900 or 1700, the Harappans moved east into what is now North India and south into South India.
Yeah, tell us a little about that.
Now, this again we know from genetic evidence that the Harappans are the ancestors of both North Indians and South Indians.
How did you find the Harappan?
The Harappans, in terms of genetically, they have found ancient DNA dated to the period of the mature Harappan period, which has a mixture of First Indian ancestry and West Asian ancestry. That is what they defined as the Harappan population, and then they modeled it to see if this is what ancient DNA is. Does it really stand as the ancestry of modern today's populations? And that result is yes.
But both North Indian and South Indian.
Both North Indians and South Indians.
And what do you call this?
Well, this ANIAS, I have tried to avoid using it as much as possible in my book because there's a history of how that came to be coined.
Yeah.
It's an artificial construct.
But expand it for the audience.
Ancestral material confuse more because there's a history of debate and discussion which resulted in the formulation of the artificial construct of ancestral North Indian and ancestral South Indian. I think it is time to do away with it because the story is told much more clearly and cleanly without that. But ANA, ancestral North Indian, is the population that results from the mixing of Harappan population, that is West Asian plus First Indian, with the incoming Aryan population, the incoming population from Central Asia. So that happened around between the period 2000 to 1000 BCE. That mixture is called ancestral North Indian. Ancestral South Indian is the mixture of Harappan population which moved down south and mixed with the First Indians who are already there. So it's Harappans plus First Indians in South India, that's the ancestral South Indian population. This is as things stood then. Since then, ancestral South Indians and ancestral North Indians have mixed. So we are a mixture of all four major constituents. So let me now complete the pizza and then I'll come to it. So the sauce is the Dravidian and the Harappans who spread their culture and their language, and all that had been perfected in the crucible of the Harappan civilization. That whatever remains in our culture, that is spread to both regions. Except that their language, there has a language shift in North India because that was overlaid by later migrants who came from Central Asia. In the south, there was no similar overwhelming migration, so those languages continued.
So their language was Dravidian.
Yes, that's what I argue. No, I think shall I go? This is a long, so take time.
Let's have the pizza first.
Okay, let me come in.
So the crust is first.
The base is the First Indian ancestry.
Harappans are the sauce.
And on top of that comes, if you like, the cheese, the Aryan. which is not spread all over the pizza, but there's more of it in some parts and less of it in other parts, but they are there in all parts of the same. And then the toppings, which of course includes as a major part the Austro-Asiatic languages, and also the Greeks, the Persians, the Arabs, the Jews, the Syrians, or whoever else you can think of. They are in a long, continuous flow of migrants into India. Those are all the topics. Except for the base, everything else you will find everywhere else, somewhere else. You may find some of it in East Asia, you may find some of it in Central Asia,
outside the subcontinent.
outside of the subcontinent. But this is the demographic pizza, in the sense that all of us carry to varying extents this combination. Broadly, you can say if you are in East India, you are likely to be carrying more East Asian ancestry. If you are in North India or Western India, you are likely to be carrying more West Eurasian ancestry. If you are in South India, you are likely to be carrying more First Indian ancestry. So the borders, you would see, the borders of this region, from where migrations come, would have a slightly lower First Indian ancestry because that's from where migrations come over time. But that's the pizza that defines us. Now, what is your question? Dravidian again is a definition of a people speaking language, Dravidian languages. So your question then thought that translate into how did this Dravidian languages come to be? And now which takes us also to the question of can we say anything about the Harappan language?
So that also relates to Aryan being associated with certain plastic forms,
That's right.
which many of us objected to.
We'll come to that. The Harappan civilization, the nature of the population that spread or spearheaded. Please remember that there is no suggestion that agriculture started with the arrival of West Asians. No, it could very well be First Asians were already experimenting with agriculture, but the arrival of the West Asians did probably bring new domesticates and did expand and speed up the transition. So there are three critical pieces of evidence that come together, and this is important. It's not just genetic evidence that come together to show who were the people, who were the Harappans. Genetic evidence we already discussed is that we have evidence of at least three major outlier individuals from regions that the Harappans were in close contact with, which carry their First Asian ancestry, 14 to 42% First Asian ancestry, and the rest Zagrosian ancestry from Eastern Europe.
This is what that paper called the Indus Valley.
So this is the that's right. This is the first farmer Harappan, because there is no difference between the question who is the first farmer and who is the Harappan. They have the same question and same answer. Because Harappan civilization is an outcome of the agricultural revolution that happened. So genetic evidence says we can actually have ancient DNA showing people, multiple people, with a mixture of First Asian and West Asian from the Zagros region. We already know this was much earlier, we already know from archaeological evidence that there are strong links between precisely those regions and Mehergar regions. Precisely those regions, and that is, I will come to that, I will come to the specifics of Zagros region of Iran, and the first place in India where agriculture began, that we have evidence for, which is Mehergar, which is today in Pakistan, where we have evidence coming from 7000 BCE. The earliest layer is 7000 BCE. And the archaeologist who led the excavation is John Franco Jaric, who is no longer, and he has written extensively on the excavation reports. And those reports are stunning. Please remember that he compares archaeological discoveries from the Zagros region of Iran from the same sites from which the ancient DNA was taken by the ancient DNA guys recently for the recent study, which is Ali Ghosh and I forget the name of the second site. This is where the site from which the ancient DNA evidence was taken was precisely the sites where Jaric studied long ago, in the 1980s, and compared their structures with what you could find in Harappa, and he called it a cultural continuum. And the similarities are, if you can wait a little bit, I can read. It's a stunning quote actually. In spite of some obvious differences, for instance, the progressive predominance has some differences. For example, the zebu cattle were domesticated in India, and so were the water buffaloes. The full setting of the farming economy at Nahardar displays evident similarities with what had been noticed in the case of the early Neolithic settlements in the hilly regions forming the eastern border of Mesopotamia. That is precisely what was and I'll just give some of the similarities that it mentions. Archaeologists have found the same kind of quadrangular houses built with narrow bricks about 60 centimeters long, with finger marks for keying the mortar, as was seen in Nahardar. Circular fire pits filled with burnt pebbles that were found in Mahargar were also common in all these Zagros settlements. And this, we know that these are still used in Balochistan today, because they use those heated stones are used to cook bread.
This is what maybe some because they didn't freeze.
So where the base, so it goes on. There's a long list of the possessions of warriors and things like that. So that's what he calls it, the cultural continuum.
So the implication being?
So archaeologically, the area of Zagros and the earliest farming regions of India are connected. And it has been so ever since these reports were written, long ago, long before genetics came into the picture. Genetically, we already discussed. Time?
No.
I mean the...
I'm wondering if we could have an interaction with Romila. She had some questions.
So let me finish the third one, because which is the linguistic. So now comes the, so these two things have to be kept in mind when we discuss what is the language. Now, if there was a significant migration from Zagros into India, in the Maharashtra region, it spread agriculture, because when agriculture spreads is when language is spread, which we know in multiple regions, because that's the population expansion. What is likely language that they brought with them? And it's likely that the language that they brought with them became one of the languages of Harappa, or the agriculture, just for the want of a better word, let's say the agricultural civilization, agricultural culture of northwestern India. And what is the language that they would have brought with them? The region from where they came later became the center of a civilization which has come to be known as Elam. But the first urban Elam civilization comes up only around 2750 BCE. And we are talking about migrations from that region to Maharashtra, 7000 BCE. So the people who came from there were obviously not products of urban Elam civilization, but people from that region much earlier. If at all we have to talk about the language they spoke, it would have to be related to Proto-Elamite in something, or Proto-Zagrosian, whatever name that you give. It is language before whatever was the language of Elam, which is called Elamite. That language went extinct long ago, but we have records of it and we have some idea what that language is. So they might have brought Elamite language. Now, keep this in mind. Now we look, the first ideas of a link between Elamite and Dravidian, or Tamil in particular, was made more than 100 years ago. Long before either archaeology, long before there was knowledge of there being a Harappan civilization, which came only in 1920. The earliest suggestions of a link between Dravidian languages and Elamite was made in 1886 or 1887 by a person, I forget his name, who deciphered the well-known Beguspoon inscription in Achaemenid Iran.
and who noticed similarities between Tamil and Elamite. This was built on by the first person to write the dictionary of Dravidian languages, grammar of Dravidian languages. But these were all mentions. The real significant substantive work was done by a linguist called David W. McAlpin in 1983. A lot of people, others had lots of objections to it, but it was a very substantive study. And now we know some of the objections that were raised, and now we have newer answers to. But anyway, this study was further, both David McAlpin joined hands with another very well-known linguist who is an expert in both Dravidian languages and Indo-European languages, which is Franklin C. Southworth. They came up with a study about 65 years ago, building on these connections. And it's important to look at what they said. Remember, even this study comes before the genetic evidence. Genetic evidence came only last year. This is 5 years before genetic evidence. And what did they say?
5 years? 65.
No, this is just 2013 or 14. They essentially said, in as many words, that it is likely that the speaker, that Proto-Dravidian speakers were moved from Iran, from a specific southeastern region of Iran, or not Iran, of I have to find the best. I mean, essentially it said they moved. It's likely that they moved from here to there after studying the root words of Proto-Dravidian and Proto-Elamite. So we are saying, independent, not relying on each other at very different time points. Archaeology, genetics, linguistics arrive at the same conclusion, which is first there is a close link between Zagros and Mehrgar and the agricultural spread, and that link is not just cultural; it is genetic, and that link is also shown in the languages, in the root words of Elamite and Dravidian. One of the objections that when people had objections the first time when this Elamite idea was put forward was that Proto-Dravidian, which is the earliest form of which is worked back from the Dravidian languages that exist in South India today. When people look back at Proto-Dravidian, the earliest words are not urban. They are more, pastoral, goats, and things like that. So there was so the idea being, I can't think of urban Harappans having moved down and brought this language to South India. Now we know that it's not likely, or it's not possible. It need not be that Harappan languages were brought to South India for the first time by urban Harappans fleeing the declining civilization, that it could have reached South India much earlier. How do we know this? We know from linguistic studies that the Dravidian languages in South India start spreading around 4,500 years ago. And as we said earlier, languages spread, the most common reason, or the most obvious reason that languages, there could be other reasons also, is when an agricultural culture expands with population. And that 4,500 years ago more or less coincides with the agricultural expansion in South India. Around 3000 BCE, you can see the first domestication of millets and pulses, independent domestication of millets and pulses, not a import from anywhere. But for a real agriculture to expand, you don't only need domesticated plants, you need domesticated animals. And we know from the work of Dorian Kufula, who is a very well-known archaeozoologist, who has done a lot of work in India, that domesticated animals were introduced to South India from North India. And we know from looking at the kind of domesticated cattle and then there. And the integration of the domesticated cattle with the already domesticated plants of millets and pulses is visible in the archaeological record of South India as the art mound tradition, which is well written about. Now, who are these people who introduced cattle from North India to South India? Now, there is a grassland that connects all the way, goes all the way from Rajasthan, North India, connects you to the Deccan. So it is likely that the people who introduced north were herders from the north, right? Herders who might have come from Zagros, because the people who came from Zagros were not herders originally, 7,000. And not all of them may have become settled. Some of them may have remained herders and speaking a language that is similar. And if that is the case, it says Dravidian languages reached India, reached South India far before even mature Harappan civilization began. So when the Harappan people moved down south, they were not introducing that language in South India. They were coming to a region which already was familiar with multiple forms of Dravidian languages. And they might have given it new life because they are coming from possible, but that's only guesswork. So a lot of the objections that were there earlier no longer hold because you have new answers. And you have further evidence from Identities. So this is why I say there is strong, very strong likelihood that the Harappans spoke a form of Dravidian language, if not as their main language, at least as their major language.
Well, yes, I just had a couple of points. Did I not say it's a very complicated story? It gets more and more complicated and more sources are brought in. But we're obviously going through a Lysenko period in this country, and we should be well aware of that. I have certain problems. Basically, I have a lot of interest, as you know, in the whole genetic development, and I'm quite enthusiastic about the work that is being done, which I think is very helpful. But I have some hesitations, and maybe this is what I would like to put across. First of all, the whole Elamite Dravidian connection is a very tentative connection. Despite David McAlpin's work, which was done in the 1960s and created a big sensation at that time, most Dravidianists were critical and remain critical. So I think one can't just take it for granted that that kind of analysis is something that is basic and we can build on it. We still have to consider the criticism that was made of it. My second problem is this business of the Indus Valley people who moved into central India and moved to South India. Why is it then that today the major archaeological map of the peninsula of India is that of megalithic cultures? That is the predominant culture all over. And as you know from the recent excavations in the Kaveri Valley, they have even found one urban site, which they're very excited about. Now, from about 2,500, the urban site is a little later, but the megalithic culture, certainly 2000 BC, coming up. The interesting thing about this is, which is why I'm bringing it up, is that in this highly developed megalithic culture, which it is compared to what was there before, there isn't an iota of evidence of any connection with the Indus Valley culture. Just absolutely nothing. Not a scratch, not a design, not a form, nothing. Absolutely nothing. So what is going on? It's exactly the beginning of the megalithic culture is when you think that the Harappans are all coming down, pushed by these guys from Central Asia, like spreading. Surely they bring something with them. I mean, we've got a little bit of evidence of this kind of overlap in the watershed and the cultures of OCP and Painted Greybear and so on. But in the megalithic culture, there's absolutely nothing. And there's nothing in central India where you've also got some megalithic sites. That's a puzzle. I can't quite understand how one can say that, I mean, I would like to believe, yes, that the Harappans did travel down into the Deccan, and it seems to make sense, but the evidence, I think, is lacking at the moment. One can't be categorical about it. I think it's much more important, and this is the point I was going to make, but I stopped at that stage. I think it's much more important in a way to raise the issue that in your Rigveda, you have Indo-Aryan, which has been infiltrated by Dravidian. Phonetically, syntactically, and in terms of vocabulary, there is the presence of Dravidian language elements in the Rigveda, and these elements increase as the Vedic texts move eastwards in the composition. This, I think, is a much more interesting argument to follow. And, coming back to my friends, the Dasyagupta Brahmins, what language were they speaking? And how is it that they learned the Aryan language so brilliantly that they were composing hymns for the Rigveda, in spite of being Dasas who were speaking another language? So that, I think, is a much more interesting question than some of the ones that we are concerned with. And my third point is that I am really uninterested in all this argumentation over dates and origins and, what does this tell us about who they were? I mean, it's very important from a genetic point of view. Historically, I think that what is much more important is that this multiplicity of sources is telling us that there are complicated relationships that are going on between different categories of people, related to different kinds of activities. And it is for historians, at least, to try and investigate those relationships.
I just want to sort of wrap up this phase of the discussion just by saying one thing, asking all of you one thing. Could it be that everything hinges on the decipherment of the Indus Valley scripts? On the deciphering of the script. Yes. If we had that, would that answer all these questions about the relationship between Elamite and Dravidian languages, the connections between the Harappans and the Aryans, all of those things? Is that what is keeping us from full Monty, as it were?
Well, if we did decipher, it would bring more clarity.
Yeah.
But I don't think that is likely to happen unless we, stumble upon something similar to the Rosetta Stone, where there are multiple scripts, or same script using multiple languages.
If I may say so, it's not a script necessarily. There's a debate on that. They're pictograms. Now, deciphering pictograms is much tougher than deciphering the script. The one person who's been attempting to do this is Irawat Mahadev. And he's come up with some very brilliant ideas about the linkage of the Rigveda to the Harappan pictograms. Plausible, but debatable.
I wouldn't be very hopeful of a decipherment.
It would be interesting, of course, but as you know, the urban gifts we have are quite limited. Not much information. Of course,